Okay, this video is going to be about while loops. Last time we learned about for loops. For loops are generally used to iterate over a collection of objects, right? So a collection could be, a string is a collection of characters, or I could have a list, a Python list, which is a collection of other types of data. And that could be a collection of strings, or a mixed type of list, where not everything in the list is a string. We could have various different types of data, like numbers, strings, Boolean values, etc. Alright, so in a while loop, while loops are used for a slightly different purpose. Now, in a while loop, you could use a while loop to iterate over a list. Okay, but the for loops are a little bit better for that. But you could do that. But usually, a while loop is used to execute some block of code repeatedly until a particular Boolean expression evaluates to false. Okay, so the code in the block runs as long as the Boolean expression provided evaluates to true. Alright, so what does this mean? So let's look at this example code here. If we have a while statement, and then this is a very simple Boolean expression. It's actually a Boolean literal, so this evaluates to false. As soon as this evaluates to false, Python says that the loop is over and it exits the loop. Because this was never true to begin with, this part of the code never runs. Alright? If I wanted a loop to run infinitely, I would say while true. And then this would be bad because this would run over and over and over. Okay, so this line of code would execute because this evaluated to true. Then this line of code would execute again because this was true. And then it checks it again. Is it true? Yes. So this, because I have a string or a Boolean literal here, true, this is never going to evaluate to false, and so the loop will never break. Okay? So if we were to run either one of these, let's open up a new file and test this out. So let's call this while loops.py. Okay. So Python will look at this line and it says, okay, we have a loop. Does this Boolean expression evaluate to true? If so, we'll execute this line. But it does not evaluate to true, it evaluates to false, so it says, okay, we're done with the loop, and then it breaks out. So the only thing we're going to see in this program is print done. We're just going to see that printed out to the terminal. We will never see this one print. Alright, so let's open up a terminal. And then run Python 3 while loops. Okay, so we see it just printed out done. Now if we make this true, this is an infinite loop. Let's just make it underneath here. While true, and we'll copy this line. Alright, so we have while true, as long as this Boolean expression evaluates to true, then this line will execute. This code block will execute. Once the code block is finished executing, Python looks back and says, okay, how about now? Does this Boolean expression now evaluate to true? And since this is a Boolean literal of true, it's always going to evaluate to true. So this is what's called an infinite loop. And you have to be careful with looping because sometimes you can run into these conditions where the program runs infinitely. Alright, so let's run this, Python 3 while loops, and we see it's just printing this out over and over and over, thousands and thousands of times. See my cursor going up? Right? So we're probably in the millions by now. Alright, so if you ever have an infinite loop like this, it's important to know how to break out of it. Okay, you can hit Control C and that stops the program. Okay, Control C sends the interrupt signal to your program, and it should quit unless the program handles the interrupt signal differently. But in most cases, Control C will break you out of the execution of a program. Okay, so it doesn't just have to be for a while loop. If you have a program that just asks for a whole lot of input, it might have 20 different input collection function calls, and you decide you don't want to actually run the whole program, just hit Control C and it stops it. Okay. Another way of doing it is if you go, say I'm running while loops, I'm going to open up another terminal tab, and if I use the PS command and then the options UX, and that stands for the user, my current user, and items that are executing. PS stands for process. So this is going to show me all the processes on my machine that are executing that belong to my user. Okay. So this is everything executing that belongs to my user, and what I would like to look at is I'm going to pipe this to grep, and I'm looking for while loop.py. Okay, so there's the line. No, this is just the grep. So let's look up Python. There we go. So these items are using Python. This is what I'm looking for. Oh, it's while loops. So I said while loop instead, so I didn't find it. It's while loops. Okay, so this is the item, and this is what's called a process ID. Okay, so I can look up which process is running, and I need to kill it. Okay, so there's another command, kill, and you pass in -9, and this is an option. There's lots of different levels of kill, but I want to completely kill the process. So make sure I have the right process here. 7813, so 713, and I killed it. Now let's go back over here, and we see it stopped. Okay, and we even got a signal, we got a message in the terminal that said it was killed. Alright, so those are the two ways you can kill a program that's running. Alright, if it's running in your terminal screen, just hit Control C. If you log out and it's still running, log in again in a different terminal tab. Use the PS command, PSUX, and you could pipe that to grep to search for something more specific like Python. Grep Python. And so these are all the programs that have Python in the name. Okay? So that's how you get out of an infinite loop. So we get sort of the concept of an infinite loop. Let's try, we're going to comment this out. And let's try a more realistic implementation of an infinite loop, or of a loop. Right? So let's say we have two variables, a and b, and we're going to set them both to true. Now this is our Boolean expression. Okay, so while a is true or b is true, if either one of these is true, then we're going to execute this code block. And let's go ahead and print a little print statement in here that says entering while code block. And then we'll put a little print statement in here. A was true. And then in here we'll say print B was true. And might as well make a little else statement and say print else. And let's see what's going to happen here. First time through the loop, is A or B true? Yes, either one of them is true, this is true, but they're both true, and that's fine. The OR statement in Boolean logic means at least one of these two items has to be true. If they're both true, that's fine, and it's still true. The only way it's false is if A is false and B is false. Okay? So A or B, That's true, and so it's going to print this line. Then it's going to check to see if A is true. If A is true, it's going to say A was true, and then it's going to make A false. So this if condition has been satisfied, and it's going to skip all the way to the end past this else statement and say, okay, we're done with this conditional statement. Is there anything else in this code block for the loop? No. And then it's going to go back to the top. And now it's going to say, okay, is A or B true? Well, we made A false, so A is going to be false, and then B is going to be true. So is this whole thing true? Yes, just one of them has to be true in order for the entire statement, the OR statement, to be true. Okay, so this is true, so that means we enter the loop, entering the while code block. We'll print out. If A is true, so A is false, so this will not execute. So it's going to skip. Since this is false, it skips down to the else if block. Else if B is true. Is B true? Yes. We haven't changed B. So this is going to print out B was true. Now we set B equal to false. Okay, now we're done with this conditional block. Okay, so it comes down here. Is there anything else in the while code block? And let's go ahead, let's add a print statement. End of while code block. Just so we can see. And we'll say start. Maybe just do something like that so we can visually see what's going on a little bit. Okay, so we're done with this conditional statement. It jumps down and says, is there anything else in this while code block? Yes. It prints this line. Now it says, is there anything else? No. Now we go back up to the top. Now remember, we've changed A to false the first time through the loop. We changed B to false the second time through the loop. So now A or B, is that true? Well, A is false and B is false. So since they're both false, this whole thing becomes false, and it skips over all of this code, and it's done with the loop, and so we'll print out done. So that is the logic flow that's going to happen here. This loop should run 2 different times, and we're never actually going to see this line of code. Okay, the reason is, if A is true, it'll execute this and break out of the if statement. If B is true, it'll execute that and break out of the if statement. If they're both false, then none of this code will ever execute, so we'll never have a chance to come down here. Alright? So these are some of the funny little issues you can run into when you're coding in computer science. You can have a block of code here that is virtually meaningless because you can never get there. You can never execute this code because logically up here, this Boolean statement prevents us from ever being able to execute anything down here. Alright, so let's run this. Python 3 while loops. Okay, start of the while code block said A was true, then it set A to false. End of the while code block. Now we go through the loop again. A or B. So B is still true, so A or B is true. Now we run the start of the code block. B was true. End of the while code block. Now it goes up and looks. A or B. Well, both of them are false, so that whole thing is false, so it breaks out of that loop and then prints out done. Okay, so this is a while loop. Now you could use a while loop to, as I said, to iterate over an object, just like you can a for loop, but it's a little bit inconvenient, right? So a for loop is better at this just because it's quicker. The syntax, really the only type of loop you really need in a programming language is while loop. You can create for loops from while loops. So for example, let's say do our classic fruits example, apples, oranges, bananas, alright, so I can make a variable called I, and that's going to be the index. So each one of these items in this collection has an index. The index of apples is 0. Okay, so while I is less than the length of my collection. Okay, so this is my Boolean statement. So as long as this Boolean statement is true, we're going to execute this loop. And I'm going to print out I, and I'm going to print out fruits, and then I'm going to reference by index. So I'm going to reference one of the items in my collection. So to reference by index, I use the square brackets, and inside the square brackets I put the index of the item I would like to see. So the index is just I. So this first time through the loop, I is 0, and then it prints out 0, and then it'll print out the 0 indexed item in fruits. Okay. Now if I don't do anything else, the loop code block will end, and it'll check and say, is I less than fruits? The length of fruits. And yes, because I will still be 0. So this is just going to print out, this is going to be an infinite loop again, because I haven't completed everything I need to. So with while loops, it's very common that you might get in a situation of infinite loops. So remember, if you do, Control-C will break out of it. So you see, infinite loop. We're printing out the index 0 in apples over and over. That's not what I want to do. What I want it to do is something more like a for loop, where I iterate over each item. So the problem here is that I have to change the value of I. I have to increase it each time through the loop. So I could say I equals whatever I did before plus 1. So that's basically incrementing. I can add 1 to I. Now we no longer have an infinite loop, because I eventually is going to become equal to or greater than length of fruits. Okay, so index 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. We have 5 objects here. So length of fruits is 5. So as soon as I becomes 5, if it's 4, 4 is less than 5, so this will be a true statement, and this will run. And then we'll add 1 to I, and then I will be 5. Is 5 less than 5? No, and that's when the loop will break. So we run this, while loops, and sure enough, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and these are the items in our list. So this is essentially the while version of iterating over a list. Okay, so that's the while version, and to show you real quick the for version, for I in range length of fruits, print I fruits I. Okay. So this is the while version. It's 4 lines of code, and this is the for version. It's just 2 lines of code. But we can see that they're the same. This is the while version, and this is the for version. So the for version basically eliminates the need for you to keep track of this variable manually and increment it every time. In the for loop, it automatically does this because the range function has a list of incrementing numbers, and so I automatically increments because of this range function. Okay, and if you don't need to print out the index in the for loop is even easier. For fruit in fruits, print fruit. So this is extremely easy. I don't even have to mess with the variable I at all, or the range function, or the length function. If I just want to iterate through this list and fruit to be one of the items in my list, the for loop version is even simpler. Okay, so that's the main difference between a while loop and a for loop. For loops aren't really necessary, but they're convenient. It's a much easier way to write a loop. It's much faster to write this than this, and keep track of all the variables separately. Okay, So while loops are the most versatile and the most powerful, and you can make for loop functionality once you have a while loop. Alright? But for loops are a little bit easier to write and a little bit easier to understand what's going on. Alright, so that's the basics of the while loop. Let's do one demo that's going to be very important, and it's extremely common in computer science. We want to collect some data from the user, and we don't know how much data we want to collect. Okay, so I might want to let's gather some information. Let's just make a list of items. Okay, so we'll call this user data.py, and what we're going to do is we're gonna have a list of collected items. Okay, we'll print out collected. You know, this should be an empty list, right? And then, you know, the length. I could even make a function that does this, and I'll call this print list, and I'll pass in some list, and what I'll say is print out the list, print out the length, and then for item in list, print out item. And we'll add a couple spaces here and make sure the item is a string. Okay, so this is a little function that's going to print out the list, and initially our list is empty, so when we do this we'll say print list, and we're going to pass in collected. So collected is our empty list here at the start. Remember, this is a function definition. This function is not executing when Python reads these lines of code. It's defining what this is. This is a function definition. Now if I actually want to execute this code block, then I have to call the function. This is a function call, and I actually have to pass in a value here. So collected is my empty string up here, but inside the context of this function definition, li then becomes whatever value I've passed in. Okay, so li becomes this empty list. Later I can print list again and pass in a different context. Okay, this is a function call again. I'm calling Python to look up this function and then execute this code block, and I'm passing in a different argument for li. So the first time I called it, this list collected, this empty list, was going to be li. Now the second time that I call it, li is now going to be this different list. Okay, so let's run these. Python 3 and user data. Okay, so printing out the list, it's empty, length 0. So that's the first print list call. It goes to the for loop, for item in li. There is no item in li because it's empty, so this line never gets executed in the first time, the first run through. Okay, second time, ABC. So it's calling print the list, there's ABC, print the length, it prints the length, and then for each item in the list, is there an item in the list? Yes, the first item is A, so item becomes A. Add spaces and then add the string version A. Is there anything else in the list? Yes. B. Item becomes B. Add the spaces, print B. Anything else? Yes. C. Add the spaces, print C. Okay, so that's what's happening there. This is a function that has a for loop in it. Alright, so and we can also add a little separator here at the top. something like that, and then we can add something at the end that says print list end. Now we run it. So this just kind of tells us what's going on in our output, right? It's kind of hard to tell exactly when the print list started, right? So if we add these little indicators on top, we can say, okay, this is what was all printed out inside of my function. All right. So basically what we want to try to do here is we want to collect user input in a loop. Okay, so we're going to say user data equals, and we're going to use our old function input. So enter some text, and we don't really care. We're just going to keep track of what the user input. You know, in other programs, you're going to use this type of thing a lot, where you're collecting user input via a loop, and you're going to want to specify what particular types of data they should use. But in this case, we don't really care. We just want to show that we can collect data. All right. So enter some text, and I'm going to say leave it blank when you're done entering text. So leave blank to quit. Alright, and then we add our extra little bit of space at the end. So this is going to ask the user for some data. It's going to print this message to the terminal, then you're going to type some data. So the program is going to pause until the user enters some data and presses enter. Okay. So at that point, whatever the user types in will be stored in this variable. Okay. So while user data does not equal the empty string, okay, because if the user leaves it blank, then that's when we want them to quit. Alright, so while user data does not equal the empty string, we're going to add whatever they typed into our list called collected. Collected dot, now how do we add an item to a list? Append. Okay, so what are we appending to our list? Whatever they typed in, the user data. Okay, then since this is a while loop, we want to ask them for the user data again. So this line I'm going to copy under here. So we ask them to enter some text again, and as long as they don't leave it blank, we're going to add that item to the list and then ask them again. And as soon as they leave it blank, then we have the empty string does not equal the empty string. That's false. The empty string does equal the empty string. So this statement is false, which means we break out of the loop. And then we can say print list collected. Alright, so let's run this. Enter some text. Apples, oranges, bananas, pears. I'm going to enter to leave it blank, and we printed out our list. This is the entire list. There's length 4, and all of these items are in the list. Okay, so that's how you can collect user input. One thing to remember is if you the user data, like they could just have some spaces and press enter. So if you want to make sure that's not a problem, like right now if I run it again, enter some text, apples, and then let's say I started typing something and then I didn't, and I added a couple spaces, I press enter, my program thinks that that is still, it is, there's 2 string characters there, right? So 2 string characters, 2 space characters does not equal the empty string. Okay, so if I want that to be considered a quitting condition, then I need to make sure I strip off the extra white space. Okay, so this input function returns whatever they type, and in this case it was 2 space characters, and then I call .strip. .strip removes white space from the beginning and the end of the string. Okay, if it's just white space, it removes all the white space. Alright, and then I would need to make sure to put strip down here too. Okay, So here on the previous one, it counted the 2 white spaces and it actually added the white space into our list, which isn't helpful. We don't want that. So this time I've saved it and we're going to run it again, and now if I have white space in there and that's all, then it's going to consider that the end. Right, there's just one item in the list. We could run it again. Okay, so that is a while loop, and that is collecting user input in a while loop, which you are going to be using for your lab assignments. Okay, so this is something very common that you want to do. Defining this function in this style, where you can just print out a list, that's something that you might do for debugging purposes or to print out a list in a pretty way. This is also something very common. Granted, we only called it once in here, but we could call it every time in the while loop to see where we're at. Right? If I just move this function up, then every time we collect user data, we're going to print this out. And so that's kind of the power of the function. I can just add this one line in this while loop instead of adding all of these lines. Okay. Apples. So then it printed it out. Oranges. Now it printed out the entire collected list. Okay, so each time I add an item, it prints out the entire collected list. Length 5. See, it was length 4, length 5. Okay, so that's how you collect user input. And that should be enough to get you going on while loops. Just know that while loops are the most powerful between for loops and while loops, because you can simulate a for loop with a while loop, but not the other way around necessarily. Okay, so and then the while keyword, a Boolean expression, if that evaluates to true, you have a colon at the end and you have a code block. If the Boolean expression evaluates to true, then the code block executes, and then it checks the Boolean expression again. It will keep running in a loop. It'll keep running that code block until the Boolean expression evaluates to false, at which point you move out of the loop and you are done. Alright, so that is enough for while loops.